The cowboy didn't ask permission. He didn't salute. He just leaned over the fire pit, flipped the steak once, and said, "You can hang me tomorrow, but I ain't letting good beef rot." 3 German women POWs stood frozen beside the mess tent, their boots still dusted with Texas red clay, hair damp from shower steam, clutching trays they thought would be filled with potatoes and beans. But the smell hit first, thick, rich, peppered smoke rising from a blackened iron skillet. Steak. Real steak. The man who cooked it wore no insignia, just a battered hat and a scowl that said he didn't care about Army rules or Geneva Conventions. One woman whispered in disbelief, "This is a trap." Another wept. And yet, when he laid the meat on their plates, thick and pink and glistening, he said nothing at all. No lecture, no mercy, just a nod. And that one forbidden bite, taken in silence, would change everything they thought they knew about war, enemy, and survival. The buses had coughed to a halt just beyond the camp gates, raising clouds of red dust that clung to every boot, sleeve, and thought. The heat hit like a wall, thick, unmoving, stitched with the scent of dry grass and diesel. 40 or so German women were herded off with stiff legs and hollow eyes, clutching sacks and satchels that held what little remained of the world they'd come from. Their Wehrmacht-issue skirts hung loose now, threadbare, some patched with civilian fabric. Boots cracked at the seams, sweat soaked into wool that was never meant for Texas. No one spoke. Not yet. Not when everything still reeked of fear. They had expected cages, screams, barked English, and swinging batons. One woman looked around for dogs, another mouthed a prayer. But the only thing that greeted them was stillness. A strange, unsettling stillness. It was quiet here, too quiet for war. Then someone smelled it. Not smoke from burning buildings or oil-drenched fields, but something warm, something rich, meat. They turned their heads as one, like horses catching the scent of rain. Just beyond the edge of the fence, near a cluster of low wooden buildings, a man stood over a fire pit. His hat was wide-brimmed, sweat-stained. His shirt, tucked in sloppily, hung over a leather belt that held no sidearm. His boots were worn smooth at the toe, and in his hands, tongs. The man moved slowly, flipping a slab of beef in a black skillet that hissed with grease. A few feet away, a crude wooden table held more: onions, coarse salt, something wrapped in brown butcher paper. Smoke curled skyward. The women froze. It had to be for the guards, they thought, or the officers, maybe some ceremony. But then a corporal with a clipboard approached the cowboy and barked something in clipped English. The cowboy waved him off, flicked grease from his hand, and grumbled something back. The corporal didn't argue. He just stood awkwardly, then walked away. The man returned to the fire, unfazed. The women were pushed forward. Their names were checked against a manifest. Tags were tied around their wrists. Numbers. They were given canvas sacks and told where to sleep. The guards weren't cruel, but they were mechanical, like they'd done this 100 times, which by now they probably had. But the cowboy? He wasn't part of that machine. When they were finally marched toward the mess hall, they passed within 20 feet of his fire, and that's when it hit full force. The scent of peppered fat, garlic, sizzling protein. One woman flinched as though struck. Another muttered under her breath, "They're doing this on purpose." But the man said nothing. He only tilted his hat and dropped another slab into the pan. Inside, the mess hall was a shock in itself. Bright light from uncovered windows, long tables, actual plates stacked in rows. The usual powdered eggs and beans waited on trays. But then the cowboy entered, unannounced, and placed a steaming pan at the end of the line. He pointed with the tongs. "Ladies first." The guards exchanged glances. One stepped forward, but the cowboy raised a hand. "My beef, my fire. Don't like it. Take it up with the colonel." The first woman stepped forward slowly, as if nearing a trap. She stared at the meat, charred at the edges, soft in the center, glistening. It looked impossible. He dropped a slice on her tray. No smile, no cruelty, just a nod. She stared at it. She hadn't seen beef, real beef, in over 3 years. In Leipzig, before the bombings, there had been lines for soup, for cabbage, for horse meat if you had connections. But steak? This was not food. This was sedition. She took one bite, and the war inside her began to unravel. They had been trained to resist even this. Not steak, specifically, but the slow, disorienting unraveling of belief. In bunkers, in classrooms, in cold barracks lit by weak bulbs, instructors had drilled it into them. The enemy is not like us. The American is greedy, vulgar, without honor. He will not just kill you, he will shame you, strip you, laugh while doing it. There were lectures about what would happen if they were captured. One woman, a former secretary from Dresden, remembered a nurse whispering behind the infirmary curtains, "Better to shoot yourself than let them touch you." Another remembered seeing photos of Allied soldiers grinning beside corpses. Most of the stories weren't proven, but they didn't have to be. Fear had filled in the blanks. Before the surrender, when it was clear the Reich was collapsing but the truth hadn't caught up to everyone yet, the radio still blared sermons of resolve, fight to the last breath. Women, too, even auxiliaries. There were tales of heroic secretaries who took up pistols when SS men fell, of telegraph operators who swallowed cyanide rather than be taken alive. And when the time came, when their own commanders vanished or surrendered and they stood alone on muddy roads waiting for what would happen next, they remembered those stories like warnings. If captured, expect the worst. Expect fists. Expect hunger. Expect, at best, silence. And yet, there had been no fists, no jeering, no dogs. And now, there had been steak. The woman who had taken that first bite sat down slowly at the edge of a long table. Her fingers still gripped the fork, knuckles pale. She didn't chew so much as let the meat dissolve against her tongue. Her stomach, shriveled from years of ration lines and root soup, growled loudly in approval. The shame hit seconds later. Across the table, another woman stared at her own plate, untouched. Her name had once hung from the barracks wall beside a map of Allied bombing routes. She'd monitored planes by ear, knew the whistle of a diving Lancaster from 1,000 meters. She hadn't eaten in almost 2 days, but she couldn't move. In her mind, winter. 1944. Her brother, 17, coughing blood into a wool blanket while their mother boiled snow over a candle stub to make broth. There had been a potato once, stolen from a neighbor's cellar. They'd split it 5 ways. And here now, steak. Offered by the enemy, served hot, salted, with a nod. What did it mean? What did it undo? Some of the women whispered to one another in the barracks that night. Not much, just fragments. "Do you think it's real meat? I heard Americans eat like this every day. What if it's poisoned?" But there was no sickness, no trap. Just a belly full of protein and a head full of contradiction. One woman folded the waxy napkin from her tray and placed it carefully into the breast pocket of her uniform. "To remember," she said quietly. No one questioned her. They had come prepared for pain, even welcomed it in some twisted sense. Pain would have justified their hatred, would have confirmed everything they'd been told about the enemy. But this was harder. What kind of enemy gave steak to prisoners? What kind of war was this, where dignity came not from survival, but from unexpected kindness? And what did it say about the regime they had just served, that steak felt like betrayal? The room was warm with smoke and steam, and still no one spoke. The sound of sizzling fat from the Cowboys' skillet lingered in their ears like distant gunfire, unsettling, intimate. The line moved forward. Each woman stepped toward the tray line as if approaching judgment, and the cowboy, still unsmiling, dropped thick-cut slices of steak onto the plates with the same blunt grace he might feed horses at dawn. The first woman who tasted it had to sit down quickly. Her knees didn't hold, not from weakness, but from the sudden, shocking wave that rose inside her chest. The meat wasn't just hot, it was tender. The salt hit first, then the richness of fat along the edge. She chewed once. Her eyes filled. She had not cried during surrender, not when her barracks burned, not even when she found her mother's letter under a pile of rubble. Words smeared by rain. But now, here, a piece of meat on a white ceramic plate shattered her. A second woman sat across from her, still holding the fork without moving. Her jaw was set like a soldier at inspection. Her hand trembled. She stared at the steak, then at the cowboy, who had already turned away, muttering something to the cook beside him. She whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "I don't know if I'm allowed to eat this." But she did. They all did, eventually. Hunger, after all, had no ideology. It didn't care for loyalty. It didn't recognize surrender. Hunger was a language older than fear. And now it roared inside every woman seated in that room, louder than any anthem the Reich had ever taught them to sing. One by one, the knives scraped across the plates. Some ate like ghosts, slow, numb, disbelieving. Others devoured. A girl from Bremen chewed with her eyes closed, muttering thanks to no one. Another whispered her brother's name under her breath, as though the act of eating somehow dishonored his death. A few couldn't finish, not because they weren't hungry, but because the taste carried too much. Steak was not just food. It was something more dangerous than rations. It was a memory they hadn't asked to recover. One woman remembered her father's last birthday before the war. He'd managed to buy a steak from a local farmer, wrapped in wax paper like treasure. He'd cooked it himself on the stove, humming old folk songs. The smell had filled their apartment. They ate it in silence, the way one eats during a funeral. He died the next winter, coughing blood into a handkerchief, and there hadn't been meat since. Now, here, the scent returned. And it wasn't mourning anymore. It was survival. One of the women later wrote in a diary, "That bite of meat made me feel more human than anything the Reich ever fed me. And if you're watching this far, you're probably just as struck by the story as they were. Let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? And if you want to help us tell more hidden stories like this video, press the button below this video to subscribe and click the little bell icon so we can keep bringing you stories the history books never told. Back in the mess hall, a girl with calloused hands carefully cut the fat off the edge and placed it in her mouth last. She smiled. It was the first time in weeks that she had allowed herself that expression. Another woman folded her napkin precisely, slid it into her pocket like a souvenir, and when they stood to leave, the room was filled with something strange. Not gratitude, not peace, but the weight of contradiction. The steak had nourished them, and with it came a hunger they had never expected, one for answers, for meaning, for a way to reconcile the cruelty they had served with the quiet dignity they were now being given. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. No whispered prayers, no coughs, only the occasional creak of a bed frame or the rustle of someone turning in her sheet. Most of the women lay still, staring at the dark rafters above them, their stomachs full for the first time in months, their thoughts anything but. One woman, perhaps 21, reached beneath her thin pillow and felt the wax paper still folded there. Inside it, a single strip of steak fat, salted and cool now. She had wrapped it tightly, like a relic, not to eat, but to remember. She didn't understand why. Across the room, another woman scribbled into her notebook with careful, practiced strokes. Her handwriting had changed over the past year, less rounded, more angular, as though war had crept even into the shape of her words. She wrote not about the steak itself, but about the silence that followed it. No one speaks. We are ashamed to be fed, and more ashamed that we liked it. The shame ran deep, not just because they had eaten, but because for one moment they had felt human again. And they had enjoyed it. The letters from home didn't help. Earlier that day the mail had come, and with it, stories written in pencil and desperation. One woman unfolded a small square of paper from her sister in Hamburg. "We boil weeds for soup now. Mother walks to the next town for potato peelings. The apartment burned, but the cellar still holds." Another received word from her father, scrawled across the back of a ration card. "Your brother is dead. I found him myself beneath the schoolhouse ruins. I buried him with my hands." The women read these words in silence, then tucked them into shoes, under mattresses, behind photographs. They could not reply, not truthfully. What could they write? That they had eaten steak? That the enemy had cooked it with garlic? That for a few minutes they had felt full and warm while their families withered in ash and silence? No. So they said nothing. One woman attempted a letter anyway. She tried to describe the weather. She mentioned the bed and the rules and the guards. But her hand paused when she reached the moment of the meal. She hovered over the word meat and then scratched it out. She wrote instead, "We are alive." And that was the most she could bear to tell. The intimacy of it, the flavor, the warmth, the sudden gentleness of it was too much. It wasn't just that it had been delicious. It was that it had been offered without violence, without condition, without even explanation. The cowboy had served it as though they weren't the enemy, as though they were people. That was what unsettled them most. They had been prepared to be broken, not to be restored, and so they lay there, wrapped in government-issued blankets, staring at the ceiling, their thoughts louder than bombs. Some turned their backs to the room. Others kept their eyes open until morning. In the quiet, grief turned inward. The war outside had ended, but inside them, something else had begun. A new kind of conflict, one without trenches or borders, a reckoning between what they had believed and what they now knew. The stake had been real, and the pain it brought had nothing to do with hunger. He had known that pain long before the war ever reached them, before the girls stepped off the buses with dust in their hair and ash still clinging to their collars, before the uniforms and the tags and the silence. His name was Elijah McKinney, though nobody used it much anymore. Most just called him Mac, or the cook, or sometimes that old cowboy. He didn't wear a uniform, didn't salute, didn't bark orders or speak unless he had to. But he showed up every morning before dawn, and he lit the fire himself. Mac had served once. France, 1918. He was just 19 then, same as half of these girls now. A farm boy from outside Lubbock who shipped off thinking it would all be over by Christmas. Instead, he watched friends drown in trenches and bleed into foreign soil for a war no one really understood. He came back with shrapnel in his shoulder and dirt under his fingernails he swore still wasn't American. After that, he'd sworn off war altogether. But then it came again. By the time America entered World War II, he was too old to fight, but not too old to lose. His first boy, Charlie, went missing somewhere outside Bastogne. His second, James, made it as far as Munich, only to be killed in a shelling 2 weeks before VE Day. The letters came folded in official brown envelopes, one with a condolence, the other with a check. Neither meant anything. So, when the Army asked if he'd help run a mess tent for the German POW camp being set up outside town, Mac said yes. Not for the money, not for the flag. Just so he'd have something to do besides watch the porch boards rot and listen to the wind. But when the trains came, and he saw the women stepping off, thin, ragged, eyes too old for their faces, something in him twisted. These weren't soldiers. They were secretaries, nurses, radio girls. They looked like school teachers, like waitresses, like the girls who used to dance with his sons at county fairs. One of them tripped coming down the steps of the bus. She caught herself on the rail, but no one moved to help her. Not the guards, not the sergeant. Just stared. That night, Mac didn't say a word. He went home, butchered a steer, salted the cuts himself, and loaded the meat into the back of his truck. The next morning, he started the fire. When the corporal came out, eyes wide at the smell, Mac just shrugged. "We got too many cows. Be ashamed to let this one go to waste." "You can't serve that to them," the man stammered. "I just did." There was a report written. Some officer up the chain frowned and stamped it, but no one stopped him. The prisoners ate, and Mac kept cooking. "The war ain't their fault," he told the chaplain once, when the man asked him why. "They're just kids. I've buried too many boys to hate these girls." To Mac, it wasn't politics. It wasn't defiance. It was just right. A hot meal wasn't forgiveness. It was a line in the sand, a line he could hold, even if nothing else made sense. The steak didn't make the war go away, but it made it stop, just for a moment. And for Mac, a man who had lost everything to gunfire and silence, that moment was enough. The guards didn't know what to do with him. Mac wasn't one of them, not technically. He didn't answer to the army, didn't salute, didn't wear the uniform, didn't care who outranked who. He was just the cook, and somehow that gave him a kind of immunity. The steak episode wasn't the first time he'd gone rogue, but it was the first time it made everyone stop and stare. When the smell hit the air that morning, rich, heavy, unmistakable, it rolled through the camp like wildfire. The guards looked at each other, unsure if they were being tested. One corporal muttered, "Jesus Christ, is that ribeye?" Another leaned over the mess rail and squinted toward the fire. "That ain't regulation," he said. But no one moved to stop him. Not really. The lieutenant on duty, fresh from training and trying hard not to look it, stood with his clipboard and pretended to read. He cleared his throat twice, as if preparing to object. But then he saw the line of women, heads lowered, waiting with hands clasped and empty plates trembling ever so slightly. And Mac, quiet, methodical, just kept flipping steaks, one hand on his hip, the other holding the long tongs like a priest performing a sacrament. Nobody had the heart to interfere. Later that afternoon, the guards would gather behind the supply shed, passing a cigarette back and forth. "You see the one with the braid?" someone said. "Cried when she sat down." Another nodded. "Didn't even touch the meat at first. Just smelled it, like she couldn't believe it was real." Some still disapproved. "They're prisoners," one insisted. "They shouldn't be eating better than our boys." But others started to waver. Not all at once, quietly. It began with the smallest things: an extra ladle of soup, a second blanket passed through the bars without a word, a hand that didn't push, a gaze that lingered a moment longer than duty required. The women noticed. They didn't speak of it out loud, just as the men didn't. But it was there, under the surface, like a radio signal too faint to decode. This wasn't what they were told. This wasn't what they feared. Back in training, they'd been shown diagrams of American brutality, heard lectures on camps where women were humiliated, starved, violated. There were stories about whips, electrified fences, dogs. The Reich spared no detail. The Americans were beasts, they said. No pity, no law. But here, in Texas, the barbed wire was rusted and half-collapsed in places. The guards wore sunburns and boots that didn't match, and now steak. One of the women, Ursula, whispered to her bunkmate that night, "If this is punishment, what does that make home?" The line drew no laughter, just a silence that settled like dust on the floorboards. That same night, the guards heard something strange, humming, faint, slow, almost mournful. A lullaby, a German folk song barely above a whisper. It drifted through the wooden slats of the barracks like smoke. One of the sergeants paused while writing a report and didn't finish the sentence. No one knew what was happening exactly, but something had started to shift. The myths were cracking, not just for the women, but for the men as well. One guard, the oldest, stared out at the women from the fence line. "What if we've all been lied to?" he muttered. No one answered. But no one disagreed. The barbed wire still stood, the guns were still loaded. But the war, at least here, had taken on a different shape, something quieter, something stranger. And with each steak that sizzled on that fire, a little more of the old story began to burn away. Days passed, and life in the camp returned to its usual rhythm, or something that resembled it. Morning roll call, chores, the smell of bleach in the washroom, the drone of insects thick in the Texas heat. But beneath that routine, the women carried something new, invisible but heavy, like an ache behind the ribs. The steak had not left them. It lingered, not on their tongues anymore, but somewhere deeper in the hollow place between hunger and memory. One woman, Marta, found herself thinking of her mother as she scrubbed laundry along the wooden washboard. She hadn't thought of her in weeks, maybe months. Not since she'd last seen her through the window of a train, waving weakly as the smoke swallowed her. That steak, she realized, had tasted like her mother's cooking back when there was still butter, before ration cards and air raids and fear. The memory hit her mid-scrub, sharp and disorienting. She stopped and just stared at her hands, wrinkled from the soap. It wasn't just food, it was remembrance, unwelcome and tender. That night, another woman dreamed of the cowboy. He was standing again by the fire, that same old hat, the same steady movements. But in the dream, he didn't serve steak. He handed her a mirror instead. When she looked into it, she didn't see herself in uniform. She saw herself as a child sitting beside her father at a wooden table, a bowl of stew between them, the smell of beef and onions, the sound of rain on the window. Home. She woke up crying, the sound muffled into her blanket. For years the war had taught them to erase these memories, to harden, to see sentiment as weakness. Food was supposed to be fuel, rationed, standardized, flavorless, but this steak, illegal and undeserved, had done something dangerous. It had reawakened the part of them that could still feel longing. During inspection the next morning, a guard noticed a woman staring out toward the hills beyond the camp. "Something wrong?" he asked in broken German. She shook her head. But in truth, she didn't know how to answer. The sky was too big, the air too kind. She felt wrong for noticing. To eat well while the world starved, that was a guilt that didn't fade easily. Each bite had carried a price they hadn't understood until later. The steak had been meat, yes, but it had also been mercy, and mercy was more difficult to swallow. Some of the women began saving scraps from their trays, not out of greed, but ritual. They'd wrap a crust of bread in cloth, as if holding on to proof that kindness had happened, even here. Others stopped eating altogether for a day or two, punishing themselves for enjoying it. The guards didn't notice or pretended not to, but inside the barracks the atmosphere had changed. Something fragile had opened and refused to close again. To them, the steak was no longer about hunger. It had become something else, a kind of message written in smoke and salt. A reminder that the world outside their ideology existed, and that it could be gentle. That realization hurt more than any wound. When they spoke of it, which was rare, they did so in fragments. "It tasted like before," one said. "It felt like shame," said another. "No," whispered a third. "It felt like forgiveness." No one replied to that last one, but the silence that followed was thick enough to hold meaning. Even now the taste lingered, not in their mouths, but in their bones. It was the taste of contradiction, the sweetness of nourishment from the hands of the enemy, the kind of flavor that would never leave, no matter how long the war inside them continued to rage. The first notice about English classes was pinned to the mess hall door, a small hand-typed sheet of paper, slightly crooked, the ink smudged by someone's thumb. "Voluntary language instruction for prisoners," it read in 2 languages, though the German translation was poor. "Learn English, Tuesdays and Fridays, Classroom B." At first, no one touched it. They walked past quickly, eyes fixed on the floorboards, as if reading it might betray something. The war was over, but inside their heads the rules still whispered. The enemy's language was poison, they'd been told. Learn it and you risk infection. But curiosity, like hunger, was hard to starve forever. 3 days later, a woman named Greta was the first to sign her name. She was older than most, a nurse by training, her hands still scarred from field work. She claimed she only wanted to understand orders better. No one believed her, but no one mocked her either. Soon, another followed, then another. By the next week, a dozen women sat stiffly at wooden desks inside a converted storage hut, staring at a blackboard where the guard-turned-teacher had written 3 simple words in chalk: bread, coffee, steak. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The guard, a soft-spoken man from Oklahoma, with hair too long for regulation, pointed to each word, saying them slowly. "Bread," he began. "Coffee." He tapped the third, smiled faintly. "Steak." The room remained still, but something unspoken shifted. When he asked them to repeat after him, the first attempts came out brittle, hesitant, half-swallowed by accent and shame. "Bread," one woman murmured. "Coffee," said another. "Steak," a third mispronounced, earning a quiet chuckle from the guard. Not cruel, just human. It was the first laughter the women had heard in a classroom since before the war. With every word, something inside them loosened. Not much, not all at once, but enough to feel. The language was no longer an enemy's weapon. It was a tool, a bridge. Each sound shaped by their tongues carried more than meaning. It carried the dangerous possibility of connection. The lessons continued, the vocabulary grew. Window, chair, freedom. Each word was a seed planted in the soil of disbelief. They began to realize that English didn't sound like propaganda. It sounded ordinary. It sounded alive. Still, not everyone could accept it. One evening, a woman named Ilse slammed her notebook shut after class and muttered, "Every word I learn feels like treason." Greta only looked at her and said softly, "So did eating." At night, under the dim light of a single bulb, Greta opened her diary and practiced writing the new words. Her letters were uneven, her spelling inconsistent, but the repetition calmed her. She wrote thank you phonetically. Tank Ju. She stared at it for a long time, then struck it out with a single violent line. It felt too raw, too revealing. She didn't know who it was for, the cowboy, the guard, or fate itself. The next day, the class began with a simple sentence. "I am alive." The guard made each woman repeat it. "I am alive." The words echoed through the hut, awkward, heavy, but unmistakably proud. Outside, the wind carried the faint smell of smoke and cattle. The women stood at dismissal, looking toward the hills, whispering English words under their breath, as if tasting them for meaning. They didn't realize it yet, but each syllable was undoing something far older than war. Language had become their quiet rebellion. And for the first time, the words of the enemy began to sound a little like freedom. The word freedom took on new weight the day the gates opened. There was no ceremony, just names read aloud, a clipboard checked, and a quiet nod from the officer. The women stepped out one by one, not marching, not fleeing, just walking into an unknown that once was home. Their uniforms were gone, replaced by donated civilian dresses, worn thin but clean. Their bellies were fuller than they'd been in years. Their skin no longer bore the grime of the front. But their minds, they were anything but clean. The train that took them back across the Atlantic was filled with silence. Some women sat upright, staring out at the foreign land they were leaving, while others leaned against the window, watching the blur of fences, trees, and red dirt disappear behind them. They didn't speak of the steak, the cowboy, or the English lessons. They barely spoke at all. Arrival in Germany was like stepping into a war that had ended without resolution. Cities had turned to graveyards of stone and ash. Rail stations were crumbling, hollowed out by bombs. The sky itself seemed grayer. One woman stepped off the train in Leipzig only to find her street flattened. In place of her childhood home stood a pile of bricks. Her mother, it turned out, had died the winter before, frozen in a relief line that never made it past the church steps. A child approached her, barefoot and hollow-eyed. He asked for food without speaking. She reached into her coat pocket and handed him the last American chocolate bar she'd saved. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just watched him unwrap it slowly, savoring every square. That image would haunt her longer than the war itself. Others returned to smaller towns, villages that had survived, but barely. They were greeted with suspicion, even envy. "You look well fed," a neighbor sneered. One woman's father wouldn't even meet her eyes. "You were captured," he said. "That is shame enough." She wanted to scream, "I ate steak in Texas, Papa. I heard music. I learned English. I survived." But instead, she nodded and went to her room. Some women tried to write it down, to confess, perhaps to explain, but the words dried up. How do you tell a nation of widows and orphans that you tasted joy while they starved? How do you admit you dreamed of a cowboy's silent kindness when your sister drowned in the Rhine, fleeing Allied fire? One woman tried to paint it. She found charcoal, paper, and sketched the mess hall as she remembered it. The long tables, the glint of meat juices pooling on tin plates, the cowboy's weathered hand laying down the steak. She drew it over and over, then burned the pages in the stove. It was not an image she could afford to keep. Memory became contraband. a hidden ration tucked into the lining of the soul. Some women hoarded it secretly, closing their eyes at night and remembering the scent of smoke and salted fat. Others locked it away entirely, refusing to speak of the camp, the food, or the language. And yet, it stayed. Not in the open, but beneath things, in the way one woman salted her soup more heavily now, or how another flinched when hearing someone speak English at the market. The cowboy, though nameless, lived on in the muscle memory of a meal that changed everything. He had fed them once, and the taste of that gift, illegal, unspeakable, unforgettable, was now theirs to carry. They came back to a land without meat, but inside them a piece of Texas still smoldered, tender and slow, like steak on an open flame. Years later, tucked into the folds of an old linen drawer in a cottage outside Bremen, a letter was found. The paper had yellowed, the ink bled slightly from age, but the handwriting was careful. The date read 1974, and the salutation was simple. To the man who didn't speak. She had never forgotten him, not his name, if she'd ever learned it, but his presence. The cowboy with the tired eyes and fire-scarred hands. She described him as someone who looked like he'd buried too many things and didn't trust words anymore. In her letter, she wrote of a steak so tender it made her feel something she hadn't known since girlhood. She didn't call it forgiveness. She didn't dare call it grace. But she said it made her see a kind of freedom, not the kind written in constitutions or shouted from podiums, but the kind that lives in gestures, in silence, in the space between enemies when they stop acting like enemies. Under barbed wire, her understanding of morality had collapsed, not because someone beat it out of her, but because someone fed her. She had been taught to believe in strength, in blood loyalty, in duty. And here came this man. No uniform, no sermon, no flag, just meat on a plate. He didn't ask who she voted for or what medals she wore. He didn't ask for her repentance. He didn't even look her in the eye when he laid the steak down. That quiet changed her. When she returned to Germany, she watched others wrestle with grief and guilt through fire and rage. Some burned old flags. Others joined protests or buried their past in drink. She did none of those things. She became a schoolteacher. She taught girls who had no memory of war how to ask questions their mothers had been too afraid to ask, and once, during a history lesson, she told them, "The most dangerous thing about evil is how ordinary it feels when you're in it. The only way out is to notice when someone treats you differently than you were told to expect." She never named the cowboy in that classroom. She didn't need to. In her letter, she admitted she once dreamed of returning to Texas to find him. But what would she say? Thank you for breaking protocol? Thank you for feeding the enemy? Thank you for making me feel like a person again? None of those words seemed enough. So instead, she cooked steak once a year, on the same day she received it. She didn't tell her children why, but when they were old enough, she let them read the letter. The final lines said, "You didn't ask for forgiveness. You didn't ask for anything. You just cooked. But you made me understand that kindness is a choice, and sometimes the bravest act a man can commit is to feed someone he has every right to hate." Somewhere the cowboy had lived out his days, likely never knowing the weight of what he did. For him, it may have just been supper, a way to honor sons lost to foreign soil, a moment of rebellion against a war that had already taken too much. But for her, for all of them, it became something holy, a breach in the wall, a taste that meant dignity, not because it filled their stomachs, but because it told them without a single word, "You are still human." And sometimes in war, there is no greater victory than that,